Hey, so I'm going to be doing a quick live read from coming in from my parents' house. So I'm going to do chapter 9, coming in a little late just because it's been a busy couple of days and I wasn't able to get going at the same time I wanted to because my son needed to nap and this is where he's napping. So 9 we'll pick up with the aftermath of what happened at Marlpaz on the border of Angladeus, the failed attempt to sap the wall there, and the encounter between Renan and the mage that is Darebrand, although he doesn't know that's his name at the time. He just has met this very ominous magic user. But we're going to be going back to Yulinar, specifically to Diaga and his attempts to research these names given to him by Trem via Ghost, and then we'll get a little more information around what exactly is happening in the aftermath of the attack on the wall. And then a little bit extra about Velissa and the attempts by the Broken to take Udosha. So, Udo passed through the sorting chamber of the library and swept down the stairs. He carried a number of thin breads and hunks of fruit heavy with water. He shook his head as he passed door after door. It was bad enough he had to keep Elhenra from starving, but the mage had not come home the previous day either. He was starting to think he had created a toxic combination. The two might just be mad enough that putting them together was causing a bigger problem. He pushed open the door and could hear the sounds of rustling parchment and the soft clink and metallic clicks of Elhenra's unique viewing device. Udo wove round the piles of books, expecting to see her seated on a worn stool or broken chair, but was surprised to see it was Diaga, wearing Elhenra's contraption over his eyes, pawing through several books at once. The young wizard turned when he heard Udo and quickly removed the lenses, putting a finger to his lips. He whispered softly, "She's sleeping." Udo followed his pointing finger to where Elhenra was stretched out on an extensive pile of texts, snoring slightly, her hair an even wilder mess than usual. The traveler rolled his eyes in exasperation and handed Diaga a cloth containing the food he had brought, gently setting the other on the desk nearest the keeper. He walked back over as Diaga chewed thoughtfully on a piece of bread and scanned the books he was looking at, trying to make sense of his research. Diaga swallowed and broke off a bigger hunk of the thin, hard loaf and pointed to one particular paragraph. "As near as I can tell, there are only references to Adal and Adwel ibn Hazrat Einafir in the text we've got, but Elhenra assures me there is at least one volume written by each somewhere here, but it would be nondescript. No name, no title, unmarked books, and hoping to find them, right? Opening, or at least that's how she remembers it, so we are left digging through unmarked books and hoping to find the right contents." He reached out looking for a piece of fruit, which Udo handed Diaga to avoid him knocking his food onto the floor. "What I have found here is fascinating. It offers a lot of possibility, but no real certainty." Udo was reading quietly over Diaga's shoulder, something having caught his attention. "This is references to the vastness of Westia and a place called the Great Pyramid. I've heard of it in my time in the region, but I never ventured there. What did you learn?" "It's a terrible place, at least according to rumor, even by vile standards of life in that region. Tales of blood priests of Igor committed sacrifices in an attempt to unlock secrets alien to our own world, that sort of thing." "Wait." Diaga pushed a few books aside and pulled out another, slightly thicker text. "Did you ever hear anything about a Drek Bloodblade?" "Yes, next to Azra Kane, he's the most famed pirate king in the history of Plinth." Diaga turned a number of pages until he found what he sought and then stopped. Placing a finger firmly on the page, he read, "Drek had lived a life of lust and pleasure, but he also survived far longer than many of his predecessors. Rather than let his old age take him, he sought a way to prevent his own death by seeking the counsel of blood priests, leading to him fashioning the Great Pyramid northwest of Plinth as the high seat of their power in his quest for immortality." Udo rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "There was another who tried a similar thing, Istraine Cutwave, also a pirate. She ruled over the Isle of Nida, not far from Baradir, to the west." Diaga looked at him. "What became of her?" Udo laughed. "The same thing that became of Drek, I imagine. She died." Diaga said nothing, turning back to the page and reading a bit further. Udo watched him for a time before asking, "What exactly does this have to do with the weapons you were asking after?" "It's difficult to say," Diaga sighed, closing the book and rubbing his eyes. "Elhenra knows much more about these matters, but navigating the web of her thoughts is a challenge. I did learn something that I think is of value. This Immorbellum, the event that signified some sort of conflict among the gods. It coincides with a number of other strange occurrences, such as... There are several temples where priests have not had contact from their deities for some time, going back almost exclusively to the Immorbellum. Similarly, rumors of dragons and other creatures never heard of before don't occur until after the period that is believed to have been the Immorbellum. If I recall," Udo said, "there were a number of gods whose temples here in Yulinar have been found empty for some time. However, even more recently, Galaron ceased to appear in his holy house as well." "The god of magic." Diaga furrowed his brow, now scanning the books scattered about him and pulling a few volumes towards him. "I didn't note any connection between he and the Immorbellum. As I said, this has only been discovered recently. Galaron is not a very active deity, nor does he have many priests. Most who serve him in their way are wizards like yourself. It could be he was absent for far longer and simply went unnoticed. Perhaps, but regardless, all this is speculation. All I know is there is an event, coinciding with what Olhenra tells me is the Immortellum, where the direct presence of gods and their powers among mortals suddenly ceased, and only in temples dedicated to the deity and through dreams could contact be made. Something, whether it was this conflict she speaks of or another event, severed a tie between our world and theirs, and then a number of the gods seemed to disappear. Well, if it was a war, perhaps they died. Diaga did not answer. Instead, he pushed a few books away and selected several others. Something occurred to him as he was about to open one and resume his research. He looked at Udo, who was chewing thoughtfully on a piece of fruit and looking at a number of history texts nearby. If you don't mind, I think I need to rest before I continue. Udo popped the last piece of food into his mouth and smiled. Of course. Would you like me to take you back to Athor Einelmann's home? Diaga rubbed his head nervously. I don't think so. If it's all the same, I'm going to sleep here. Udo studied him for a moment, and Diaga could sense his suspicion. Then he gathered the cloth he had brought the young man's food in and pocketed it. Very well. Make sure she eats something, would you? Diaga nodded, and Udo left quietly. The wizard peered across the room at Olhenra, still fast asleep, and made himself as comfortable as he could among the books on the floor. He closed his eyes, wondering at first if he would be able to rest, and then he was suddenly waking up as though it had been only moments, but the burnt-out torches and total darkness told him it was much later. Stiffly he moved from his position on the stone of the floor and squinted. He realized the darkness was not as complete as he had thought. There was a faint candlelight coming from across the room. He rose and made his way towards it, careful not to disturb the unsteady piles of books and writings around him. Peeking about one such tower of leather-bound texts, he saw Olhenra sitting cross-legged on the floor, a great number of yellow loose sheets on her lap, writing in a spidery hand. Diaga stepped forward and said, So these are Adal's writings. Olhenra nearly leapt out of her skin, having not sensed he was near. She quickly tried to stuff the pages behind her. I thought you were asleep. I didn't want to wake you. You didn't. Let me see the pages, please. Olhenra's eyes were wild, though with fear of something worse Diaga could not say. She slowly brought her hand from behind her back and laid them on the ground, running her other arm across her face. Diaga knelt in front of her and took one sheet, holding it up to read by the faint light. The language was one he did not recognize, though some words seemed familiar. He lowered it to look at Olhenra over the page, and as she said, I was translating some of it for you, the relevant portions, but it's draining work. Yes, translation is taxing. I don't mean translation. Olhenra's cry was full of frustration and impatience. You don't understand. I keep you at a distance for your safety, Diaga Corsair, but you insist on delving further. You said you were willing to take the risks, but you don't even know what they are. Then tell me, Diaga said. Read and you'll understand. That is Adal's account, older than Adwell, and perhaps less informative, but it's enough. Diaga took the translated sheets and began reading, slowly at first, then with increasing rapidity as details unfolded. He was soon flipping through them in almost no time, consuming every word voraciously. Fascinating, utterly fascinating. Olhenra said nothing, but kept watching him intently. Diaga reached the last page, and his pace slowed significantly. His face went pale as he ventured to tear away from the words to meet Olhenra's crazed eyes. He went through, to the beyond. Yes, and he did not come back. No. Then how? How do we have his writings? Precisely the question you should ask, though maybe one better left unanswered. It's a forgery, then, a work of fiction. You know that's not true. Diaga said nothing but reread the words on the last page. In daring to believe there is something more than our world or dreams, or that malleable domain of immortals, I have sought more, and in doing so found it. In this other place, this beyond, there lies so much outside my comprehension that it defies my explanation, and by exposure to it I have ceased to be what I once was. The gods know, of this I am certain, and it is what they have tried to shield us from. But I found it, and I have walked across that thin line between what is real and comforting to what is yet more consuming and thus terrifyingly enlightening. It was a blessing to know as little as I once did, and my doom to know what I do now. The Immortellum was not fought for right of rule or authority, but for salvation. The gods know what lies in the beyond and can make and unmake, and they devised a way to shield themselves from it. But to do so, they made pacts with other darker sides of themselves, and of mortality, and the weapons to match. I, in my foolishness, sought the beyond in belief it would open new vistas of understanding about our very existence, and I was correct. But there were other things in that infinite space which lapped with unending tongues at the river of life, poisoning its waters and my mind. I should have listened to the wisdom of the first mortal who bade me turn back, but I was arrogant and superior. Now I'm forever lost, and I will not remain in my mind for long. I can feel that ever-hungry presence near me, waiting to devour me. If with my last moments of control I can send this warning back to others, I will, and I can only hope they heed my words. Do not seek to pierce the veil. Olhenra watched him silently as Diaga set the paper down and stared for a time at the dark wall, light dancing from the candle and the flickers upon it. He turned to the keeper and pulled a small parcel from behind him, the food Udo had brought, and handed it to her. Eat. You need it. Olhenra took the food wordlessly and unwrapped it, chewing the hard bread first. Diaga watched her, his eyes drifting reflexively back to the pages, and then he said, He referenced weapons and a first mortal. It seems that would be relevant for my search. Yes, the first mortal is likely a revenant. A doll must have traveled to the Sky Table Plateau. You said this is the older of the two writings. What about Adwel Ibn Hazrat Ainafir? Are you translating those two or hiding them from me? Ulhenra glared at him. I have them, and they need not be translated, but we must talk first, before I can let you see them. All this time you've known where the texts I sought were, but you've shoved piles of histories and references to works before me instead of presenting the genuine records. Diaga could not contain his frustration. If you don't wish to help me, then say so. I told you what the danger is. Ulhenra set her food aside and stood, feebly brushing dust from her robes. You're a mage, a user of arcane powers that brought about the most dangerous conflict in Testanir's history and unleashed demonic forces on our world. Rifts opened between Testanir and a darker place. What do you think that place was? Diaga understood at last. You mean the beyond. You're saying the rifts, those tears in our world from which daemons are said to come, those are portals into this place that Adal became trapped in. Yes, and the greatest threat came when a master of the arcane, the god sorcerer, tore across our world with unspeakable beasts at his side. I'm not that man, nor am I half as strong as he was. And maybe that makes the danger all the more serious. What if you seek out this place and it consumes you? I can feel it tugging at the back of my mind, even just reading accounts of it, studying the threads that tie the history together, and I've no gift for magic. What might it do to you, Diaga Corsair? Diaga had no answer for her, but stood as well. He looked down at the sheets of paper on the floor, the common translation of Adal's dark and foreboding account. He brought his head back up and said, I was told to seek only information on the weapons, of which it seems all records, even Adal's, contain just vague rumor, but everything continues to refer back to the Immortellum, which seems to inevitably lead to a twisting world of this beyond. I don't wish to seek it out as Adal did, but with the rifts and these threats to our world, it seems the beyond seeks to come to us. The war Narath is making against all mortality, the prophecy that Trem will cause Ulinar's destruction, all those threads can't be coincidence. They're cut of the same cloth. I just can't yet see how it weaves together. Ulhenra sighed and her shoulders slumped. No, nor do I, but I agree it is not coincidence. Well, then I would seek to understand all that I can so as to better be prepared for whatever danger it might pose to our world. To be informed is not to seek power, though you were right to tell me earlier that there is danger in knowledge. Ulhenra kept her head lowered, but her eyes were raised in deep study of Diaga and careful consideration of him, as though she could determine the sort of man he was just through her stare. She walked towards him, putting her hand on his cheek gently, and looked even deeper, until he felt she was looking past him to something even he was not aware of. At last she let her hand drop and turned, reaching beneath a small desk, and, from a hidden compartment, pulling free a slim book of dark green with golden highlights. She handed it to him, and as Diaga took it, she held it tight as well. You may read it here, but you can take no notes, nor can you leave this room until you are done. You may only study it when I can watch you, and you must obey every command I give. If I tell you to stop, if I take it away, you permit it. Do you understand? I understand, Diaga said. Ulhenra released her grip then, and turned to clear him a space. She pulled up a stool and gestured for him to sit. As he did, she dug out her own seat and pulled up near him, but in a position where she was able to watch the mage without seeing the words in the book. Adwel Ibn Hazrat Ainafir was mad, and there is little rhyme or reason to his work. He did not enter the beyond, at least as far as we know, unless by some miracle he was able to come back, but he dabbled in dark arts for so long they consumed him, and though he somehow lived for many hundreds of years despite being to all appearances a normal human male, his death was horrific. If you wish, I can give you records of that event when you leave. She placed a hand on Diaga's, resting atop the nondescript book. Be wary. What you read will twist and burrow into you. It will take root, and you would do well to have your guard up so that it does not spread too far within. Diaga waited for a few moments. Then Ulhenra removed her hand and sat back, her eyes fixed firmly on him. He turned back to look at the thin volume, so inconspicuous and unthreatening before him. Then with a breath of determination, he opened the book and began to read. Varasho winced in pain as the cold water splashed against his back, gritting his teeth. Nemel scowled at him from the side of the table. You could have let the priests use their prayers to heal some of this. It's going to be tough going for you this way. Varasho shook his head. They have more pressing injuries to care for. Varasho. Nemel ceased trying to clean the burnt and blistered skin and knelt so they were eye to eye. There were hardly any survivors who could be helped. It was a slaughter and you're lucky you're not among the dead. The prince did not answer but turned his head away. Nemel sighed and went back to his work, waving over an assistant with a few poultices. I had these imbued with some of the faith. If it will expedite your recovery, we need you at your best. It sounds like Renan met the master of this fortress and was left with ominous warnings. Yes, I've heard the rumors. Nemel took the poultices and pressed them to Varasho's back firmly. The pain shot through him, and then a sensation of tingling, almost itching vibration went across his back. The prince shifted, but Nemel put a hand firmly on his shoulders and held him down. You stay there until I tell you to move. Varasho, recognizing the sternness in Nemel's voice, broke no argument, laid still and tried not to think about the unending skittering across his skin. The tent flaps opened and a servant came in bearing a hawk on his arm. a small wooden container strapped to its leg. Nemel intercepted them before Verasho could move, taking the capsule and walking it over. It has your house seal on it. Open it, would you? And place it where I can read it. Nemel followed the instructions, careful not to allow Verasho to move as he did. He pulled the letter, which was brief and written on a single page, free of the container, and set it in front of the prince. Verasho raised his head, which Nemel helpfully propped with a small pillow, and looked at it. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the hand the document was written in. It's from my father. Nemel said nothing, instead moving to the wash basin to clean his instruments. He was soaking and scrubbing some of the finer tools when Verasho shifted loudly enough behind him to cause him to turn. Against his orders, the prince was sitting upright, holding the letter in his hands, a look of disbelief and sadness on his face. Nemel, rather than chastise him for ignoring his instructions, rushed over. What is it, Verasho? Wordlessly, the prince handed the letter to the field surgeon, who read it swiftly and brought his hand to his mouth when he realized what it contained. His eyes came up and saw Verasho staring at him. The two did not need to say anything, each knowing what the paper meant for both of them. Nemel sat it unsteadily on the padded bench Verasho had been laying on and stared at it a while longer, as though he hoped the contents of the words would change. Verasho spoke first. Truth seekers. I'd assumed it was just wild rumor. Nemel said nothing, so Verasho continued, trying to engage his friend. If I'm going to leave, you should come with me. I could use your help if I'm going north. No, Nemel said quietly. You couldn't. I'm of no use to you, and it would look suspicious. Why bring a field surgeon, especially now the priests are back performing their duties? I was going to return home to Dune again anyway. And what if the truth seekers are there? They will be. If they find me out, well, then they do. It'll be much worse for you. Verasho scowled and, even stiffened in pain, hopped down from the table and reached for his shirt. Nemel tried to stop him, but the prince pushed him away. He pulled his arms to the sleeves, letting the cloth settle on his back as the poultices fell free, and winced as it touched his tender skin. Nemel crossed his own arms and glared at him. I know we're only friends now, Verasho, but I do still care for you, and the least you could do is drop your stern, righteous act and listen to reason with me. Your father might be asking you to go north and find this Napoleon resistance, but you could take that ship anywhere and get free of this place. You don't have to come back. Verasho's head turned sharply. I'm an Anglodaec, a Hawking. I'm not running away. If you're going home to face what will come, I will too, one day. If this will ease my father's fears and aid our efforts, I'll do as asked. But I will come back. It is my duty. Duty? Nemel threw his hands up in the air in exasperation. What duty do you owe a country that would brand you as a sinner, an affront to all our beliefs? You, who have stood and defended Anglodaeus at every turn, who recites the code as though it's your life's blood. Nemel stepped closer to Verasho, his face inches from the prince's own. I have my parents to care for, patients to look after, but your father has an entire nation to protect him. You owe this place nothing. Your father knows it, and clearly he wants you to be safe. So go and stay gone, please. Verasho watched the tears run down Nemel's face and put an arm around him reassuringly. He held him close a moment, then stepped back, keeping one hand on his shoulder. If I don't come back, how will I prove them wrong? I believe in the code and Anglodaeus, and I believe that in my flaw is what I have been tasked by Paladinus with overcoming. I'll not run from it. I'll defeat it. A flaw. Nemel's voice was broken, full of hurt and defeat. So that is what we are. Flawed. You didn't always think so. Goodbye, Verasho. Without waiting for a response, he shrugged his friend's hand off, gathered his things, and swept out of the tent. Verasho stood in the middle of the makeshift quarters, head bowed, his long hair over his face. He struggled to breathe a sense of calm. It did not come, and in a rage he kicked over the heavy brazier that heated his tent, scattering coals and embers on the cold ground where they flared and began to dull. The cold of the outside came in steadily, but it was a welcome feeling. Verasho picked up his father's letter, imploring him to go to Lowwinter and make contact with any Napoleons opposing the invaders that he could, and to shelter himself from the burning questions of the truth-seekers. Crumpling the paper, he tossed it among the slowly extinguishing embers, and buttoning his thin shirt, went to find Boehmer and Renan. Renan Nordland was standing in his own tent, the dual small braziers at each end burned low already. It was almost morning, dawn would come soon, but there would be no warmth in here. Winters were mostly mild in Anglodaeus, but the evening's unnatural cold matched the mood in the commander's tent. Boehmer sat across from him, his body, still somewhat overweight but showing progress, folded on itself. The former leader of the army was ashamed he'd failed to prove himself useful to his new commander, and he had said nothing since they returned from the wall. Renan was, for his part, trapped in the looping re-experience of the conversation with the mysterious mage. He could not stop thinking about his assertion that eventually the Nerathians would come for Anglodaeus, nor could he ignore the confidence in that sinister voice when he assured Renan they could not stop him, even if they got past the wall. The commander straightened and looked at Boehmer, his downcast eyes on the table and his tired shoulders slumped in defeat. Renan sighed. Geleden, it's not your fault. It was a good plan. I appreciate you saying so, my lord, but it was not. The former High Lord brought his eyes up and met the gaze of the younger man. The plan, if good, would have at least got us inside the wall. Instead, it served only to convince our men we can't win. Verasho entered then, his shirt mostly open, and came to stand beside Renan. The other two regarded him with looks of concern, but the prince waved them away. He turned to Boehmer. Renan is right, you know. Your plan was solid. This is not an enemy we understand. No, Renan agreed, and one we likely cannot hope to defeat. We have to keep fighting, Verasho said sternly. He picked up one of the small tablets from the war table, and I think we have been given a chance to try a different approach. He placed a chip behind the dark model representing the fortress and looked up at the others. Wemmer sighed. Naturally, that's the goal, but how? Of course. Renan rounded the table and crouched down, staring at the piece behind the pillars in the fortress. We attack them from behind the fortress, not the front. It's made to keep us inside, not keep others out. We're thinking of it as a castle or fort, a traditional siege, but it's really just a wall, and the traders tell us the lands beyond are all held by Nerathians. They'd never expect an attack from their own holdings. There's a town, Vrasha said quietly, on the coast not far north of the pillars called Lowwinter. We could sail there and muster forces to strike the fortress. Muster forces? Wemmer scratched his balding head. You mean recruit the northerners to help us? Consider it. Renan pointed to the lands that would have lain outside the northern edge of the table. The Napoleons have been occupied for some time, but many surely are not happy to have been taken over by outsiders. We've heard rumors of a rebellion among the people. I say we send falcons north and try to reach someone in Lowwinter. Maybe the note will fall in the right hands. Varasho and Wemmer regarded one another again in silence. Then the former High Lord shrugged and said, Send a raven instead, my lord. The northerners use those birds to carry messages, and they will recognize it as a sign of correspondence they can trust. I can see if some of the merchants in Barrow still keep ravens. Do so, Renan said, and send as many as they have. We will rain requests for aid on Lowwinter, and hopefully one will find an ally willing to help us. Varasho shook his head and sighed. There's not much else to be done. I'll prepare a report for Alderlast. He turned to Wemmer and said, Can you bring word to my father? There's a message I have to send him. Wemmer was surprised at Varasho address him directly and so solemnly. Of course, my lord, I'll see to it. You can leave after you rest. It's a long journey, and this has been a difficult night. Wemmer bowed and said his goodbyes, leaving the tent. Varasho remained a moment, pulling Renan aside to inform him the prince had to go north, where they received word from the Napoleons, but the High Lord would have to remain behind, managing the army. Renan, despite his desire to be part of the venture, agreed. Varasho was grateful he had asked no questions about the prince's sudden willingness to abandon the heart of the campaign and left quietly. The tent flap closed, leaving Renan looking down at the war table, his eyes fixed on the small circle etched with a hawk that showed one unit north of the wall. He eventually picked it up and examined it closely before tossing it on the table and sending for his servants to put out the lantern so he might attempt a few hours of sleep. The doors of Guy Lakill's east gate were left open just wide enough for a single person on foot to pass through, and the half-dozen representatives of the town stood outside it, watched the three figures approaching them slowly on foot, coming down off the hill where their army was arrayed. Mara stood next to Edward, shaking her head in sadness and fighting back tears. I'm glad my husband didn't live to see this. He'd have died right then of a broken heart if he did. Edward said nothing, standing impassively with his thick arms crossed. He watched the three come closer and closer, studying them as they became clearer. The woman carried herself like a soldier, dressed in chain and plate, made to provide ample movement and protection. She was a real fighter, that much he could tell, and her long blonde hair and suntanned skin might have been contradictory if he didn't recognize those telltale signs of a Napoleon when he saw them. It churned his stomach to see one of their own working with the enemy, and he wondered how many had turned to their conquerors as soon as the empire fell. The other two were shorter men, one looking like the product of a great number of bar brawls, but likely capable of using those curved blades riding at his hips. The second was rat-like and seemed to crouch down as though trying to be unseen, even though he was fully exposed in the open sun. They stopped at last, perhaps some 50 feet from the council, and the woman stepped forward. Leaders of Guy Lakill, your signal suggests you wish to parley. No one spoke at first, then a few others jostled one of the merchants forward. He appeared terrified, but managed to stutter as he said, We do. Your army is too vast for us to hope to stand against you, and we have heard of the horrors visited on our fells to the east. We wish to be spared that treatment. Unwilling to let Belissa be the only spokesperson, Hrothgar stepped boldly in front of her, chin high and hands behind his back. And what will you provide us to be worthy of our mercy? There was some conferring among the council, which Mare and Edward also remained out of. The decision on what to offer had been a contentious one, for in truth there was not much they could give. 1,000 coins of varying value had been collected, but it was not going to be enough to satisfy their foes. Worse, they were so low on food and water that handing out even a tenth of it over would be a disaster. The spokesman finally turned and said, We can offer you a chest of money from our residence. It's not much, but it's what we can give. We fear that we are short of supplies and cannot hope to offer you enough to satisfy even a small portion of the army. The fear was easy to hear in his voice, and Hrothgar's narrowed eyes and curled lip indicated the man had good reason to be afraid. This is a joke. We stand before you capable of burning the town to ashes and taking the lives of every one of your people in the process, and you offer us what you do not need? We can, and will, take everything we wish. Surprisingly, it was Gornath that came beside Hrothgar and whispered, Don't go threatening them, you fool. We have food and water, enough already. What we need is lumber and labor to build war machines, or we won't be getting inside the walls of Aves any time in the next 100 years. Hrothgar glared at him. I'll handle this, bandit. Your concerns are noted. He's right, Hrothgar, Belissa said. We need them. And the town should be left intact, Gornath added. When this is over, I want to make Guy Lakill the seat of my new kingdom, in service to your Lord Wolfbane, of course. Belissa was caught unprepared for the revelation that Gornath might be thinking long-term rather than satiating himself with a campaign of destruction, which was motivation enough for most Broken. Of course. The three turned back to the council, and it was Gornath who took charge. He stepped forward, one hand on the hilt of his sword, and paced up and down before them, studying each as they quivered before him. Only Mara and Edward met his fearsome looks without flinching. The Broken leader smiled, which was quite unpleasant. Very well. I'll tell you what we'll take from you, and in exchange you shall pledge Gallakil to us, and give over the town to our leaders. The majority of the army will remain outside the walls, while our commanders and their forces shall take up residence within. The leader of the council nodded. Good. Then first, we need 500 men, and all the lumber you have, as well as at least a dozen smiths and engineers or apprentices in those crafts. They'll be responsible for building several devices our force will bring west. When they've completed their work, they are free to return home. Agreed. And lastly, Gornath's eyes grew hard as he gave a wicked smile. Our men are in need of respite from the campaign. They long for ale and women. You'll provide both, as much as we desire. That brought a terrified silence from the council, and a number of low wails went up from the walls among those who had heard Gornath's demand. Belissa, furious, came forward and grabbed his shoulder, hissing, I'm not allowing this. It's unnecessary. What did you just say about ensuring this town was yours when the campaign ended? You want to take their mothers and daughters and rape them? Is this foulness or your stupidity? Gornath shoved her hand from his shoulder and said, I am establishing the new laws of my land, and you would do well to stay on the right side of them, Belissa Alfred. She looked at Hrothgar, but he simply smiled at her and shook his head. I see no reason to challenge Gornath on this. Make this rabble understand they've no power here. Belissa was so furious she nearly struck the Broken chieftain, but realizing it would do no good, she managed to just barely hold her temper. As she was trying to collect herself, a stammering reply came from the council leader. Agreed. In horror, Mara charged the man, screaming she would see him handed over first, but Edward, tears in his eyes, held her back from causing the merchant or herself harm. Gornath turned and gave a sharp whistle, bringing several hundred Broken soldiers whooping and charging down the hill towards the town as the council hastily retreated, and the gates were flung open. Belissa, her hand still clutching the hilt of her sword with white knuckles, stood aside as the savage mass raced into the town, chasing sobbing and fleeing refugees and residents alike as the surrender rapidly dissolved into chaos. Gornath smiled at her as he stalked past, calling after his men. Now then, boys, be gentle. We want the fun to last, don't we? Go find me the workers we need and treat them well. Maybe we'll even let some of them join us for the celebration. Her stomach churning at what she'd become party to, Belissa stormed off, walking around the wall and away from the gates. She made it to the first corner of the tower before the horror of what she was participating in caught up to her, and she vomited in the grass. She stared down at the contents of the day's meal and thought of the last time she'd been sick. What a fool she'd been to celebrate anything with this lot. The snort of a horse brought her head up, and she saw Hrothgar looking down at her, now on his steed, smiling. Perhaps you should reconsider your position here, Belissa Alfred. I don't think you're cut out for the reality of war. He rode off before she could answer, leaving her to listen to the cries of anguish and fear coming over the walls. So that's Chapter 9. I'll pick it up with Chapter 10 possibly tomorrow to try to make up for a couple of the delays. And there will definitely be one on Tuesday. So thank you for listening. You can always follow me on @LegacyChronicle on Twitter. You can also go to the Twitch page that this is being streamed on, or YouTube. If you search for Vulture X21, there are playlists for both books, and this video, among others, should be up shortly. Thanks.